if you don't have I suppose, a multi-channel attribution or a multi-touch model in place, so you are just with a one-touch attribution model in place, I suppose, where should you start? And if we go, first of all, to Cormac, where would you start with that? If you were currently just doing last click wins and you want to do this, where would you start?
I'm going to give a kind of a boring answer, but you got to start with your data. You got to start with, are you tracking your data effectively? If you're not having these conversations so far, I would probably take a guess that your data mightn't be in a great place just purely because data needs to be maintained, it needs to be set up, it needs to be understood. So what will inform an attribution model is your click data, impression data, and you need to understand where you're tracking that, how you're tracking it, and to what level it's being tracked at. So are different channels being tracked effectively? Is there any gaps in the tracking? Is there incomplete data sets? How are you bringing that data against your own data? So I guess the first starting point is kind of almost like a review or an audit and just understanding your data and to what point it's being broken down across all your marketing channels.
Okay. And I suppose, Alex, as a broader marketing professional, what would you see as, where would you want to start, or what questions would you be asking?
Yeah, no, I'll agree first up, because I think most of the problems I've seen is when the data just doesn't make any sense and people don't challenge it. So there's a bit around just good housekeeping. So, how are you tracking, how are you monitoring it? And then looking at that data, because stuff falls off sometimes, and you think you're looking at whatever that version of the truth is, whether it's last click, first click, any of the other versions. So you've just got to have confidence in what you're looking at first. And I think from that point, you can sort of move forwards. And I think, last click is a model, like it's a pure model, if you like. We'll talk about the reasons why it has huge pitfalls, but at least it's a pure model in that sense. But then I think you've got to look at your type of business, what your business goals are. Think about the buying cycle. How long is your buying cycle? Like, there are loads of different things that can impact which type of attribution model you might want to look at for your business. And the reason why I think, in the poll, people are like, the problem is agreeing. That was, I think, the top answer. I think because there isn't a perfect answer. Attribution isn't perfect. There isn't a perfect answer. So that therefore leaves it wide open to interpretation. And even though it's data-based, it's sort of, are you reading the data front to back, left to right? It's all in the interpretation, really. And I suppose just accepting, I think you just have to accept that it isn't perfect yet. We'll talk about it.
Often when we talk about attribution with clients, everybody's sort of going for this sort of perfect model, and there isn't a perfect model. I suppose when we've talked about it before, it's about, well, they're all wrong. There's one that's slightly less wrong, and that's the best fit. Because again, it depends on how many products you've got or who your perfect client is. So we've had a few questions in, and I suppose when you talk about data, when Cormac was talking about the data, I suppose, what data do we mean? And then we could tie that into someone who's talking about Facebook, and we're not going to recommend models for you just off a question, because I think that would be professionally irresponsible.
John, I saw that question come through, and it's a really good question, right? And like, the data is such a broad term. Like, when I'm talking about that, I suppose I specifically mean, if GA is what you're using to track your marketing activity and build an attribution model off, it's that data. It's your UTM parameters. It's your linking of your campaign data from your AdWords through to GA, if that's your single point of truth. And then it's also looking at your conversion events. Are they matching what you see in your internal systems? So I think you always need to have a kind of a fallback in the second kind of benchmark data point. And ultimately, everything comes back to the pound notes you're getting into your bank at the end of the day. So the first place you start is making sure your kind of conversion events are matching to your system, whether it be your web hosting platform or your financial systems. And then within that, it's tracking and understanding all of the click level data that's happening within the different platforms. And then within each of the marketing platforms, it's understanding how your campaigns and your different elements of performance are being tracked. So then you get into the point where you add that to your own commercial data. But I think the first thing is just getting your GA, if it is GA, set up correctly.
And
it doesn't always line up, right? It's sort of like, with all of these systems, there's a bit like, well, hang on, there's a difference here. What's happened there? What's fallen off a cliff? And that's the element of imperfection that you just have to accept.
And I think, I think you're right. Getting everything in one place is really hard. And I suppose practically, Tom, if you were to put this into place, I suppose, what's the minimum amount of data do we need to make something useful?
So I would say, I mean, maybe going back to your first question to begin with, as getting your data in the right place, but also what you're trying to achieve is a question I'd ask very early on in this process, because there's no point sort of going, okay, we need an attribution model when you don't know why you need an attribution model. So you should probably be asking the question internally, okay, well, what's the business trying to achieve? What are we trying to achieve by implementing a business model? Attribution model, and then from there you can then go on to implement the things you need to get the correct data. So as you were just talking about, sort of one source of the truth, and then as much as physically possible to fit into that. So there's going to be channels that you're never going to get into Google Analytics. Your offline is going to be almost impossible to 100% link into your data. So you've just got to, I guess, at a minimum, I would suggest getting all your digital into whatever your one source of truth is, because the more data you've got, the better your attribution model is going to be.
Because you're absolutely right. You can look at Google and they've got some like amazing tools in there, but it's really good at looking at those channels. So they're very, platform centric. So they come up with.
And I think that's one thing we've got as a particular team here of data scientists, and they always look at the 6 different models that Google offer within their attribution, but then they also produce bespoke models to help people based on their actual business and their products and everything that they've got. And I suppose with that sort of on and offline, how could you make that work, or is it a case where we just got to focus on the digital, or is it a case we can start tying it up? And I suppose, how would you go about even looking at that? I suppose, Matt, we'll go to you first. Linking up that.
Yeah, I think like Tom touched on there, like, and Alex said, it's a very difficult thing to do, is to kind of effectively measure your offline activity. For me, I'd always start with your categorization of your channels and how you kind of understand them. I tend to break the channels into kind of 4 buckets of your branded channels, your paid channels, CRM, and then a bucket of other, which is the things you just can't track, but they're important to be kept as a separate channel. When you think about what offline activity will be doing, it tends to drive branded traffic, people searching for your brand because an intent has been generated by some offline activity. So you should be able to see a sort of spike if you've done enough activity, or if you've done something that's pretty aggressive offline, like, TV or something that's kind of a out of home stuff. Those are the channels that you'll tend to see, and sometimes measuring against a benchmark or kind of a run rate to give you a sort of a idea there. There's more traditional methods then, like putting an offer code in advertising, and then you kind of see how many people have redeemed that. But that again is flawed as well, because there's a lot of people who see advertising and don't redeem through the code. Even through digital channels like affiliates, that's the case as well. So It's very difficult. But that's my kind of the main one I've used in the past is understanding your branded channels, and then looking at sort of variances, accepting that it's imperfect, but trying to see if you can pull out trends and see what the sort of change there looks like over those periods.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's as a sort of brand, I started out as a brand campaign manager on the brand side, and before a lot of these channels existed. I know I don't look old enough, but just good light and good moisturizer. But and they weren't commercial channels, a lot of these, so they weren't in consideration, and the tools are pretty blunt, and they still are pretty blunt. Those softer measures, and I think you have to look exactly as Colin said, your branded elements of your campaign, because let's face it, if you try and measure them on the same, whether it's a CPA model or whatever, they don't compare, because they're doing a different job. But you have to accept that they do feed into the funnel, and that if you turn them off, which is the bluntest tool of measuring if something has an impact, then you're going to see further down the funnel problems with, and you can look at that. You can turn channels on and off. You can do incrementality testing. But if you look on your branded channels for direct brand search terms, you know, direct traffic, your social media following and noise, you know, all these other things will give you, paint a picture towards it. It won't give you an exact science, but it will
hopefully give you some signposts of where then to go investigate or to look or to give some credit. And I suppose one thing where we normally start talking to people about this is and it amazes me still, some massive retailers spending hundreds of thousands of pounds a month are still optimizing to last click wins. And so if you are optimizing to last click wins, don't beat yourself up, right? Because that is relatively normal. Doing this is hard. But I suppose from your experience, Tom, why is last click wins not necessarily the best model?
So we get people in quite often who are like, we want to acquire new customers. Which digital channels can we use to acquire new customers? And those kind of questions. You know, we want to grow the brand. Growth is important, but then on last click wins, you're purely aiming for the final channel that will convert, and that's not always going to be the channel that introduced people to your brand in the first place. And you're never going to grow as quickly if you don't get some sort of reward towards the channels that are driving new customers in the first place. So maybe after they did see your video on YouTube, maybe they didn't buy anything for a few weeks and then they went through on an affiliate link. But if you're doing last click wins, you know, then that YouTube campaign is never going to get any of that share of the revenue, and you're never going to invest more into it because it just, on a last click wins model, it looks useless.
Somebody described it to me as, it's the hangover analogy, which I'm sure everyone's heard, but it's good enough to say again. It's like going out, drinking 10 pints, and then having a tequila at the end of the night and blaming your hangover on the tequila.
It's always the kebab that makes you feel.
Yeah, and that, I don't know if you have heard that, but somebody said it to me, and I was like, "You're right, that's me." I mean, no, sorry, it's not me, but it is exactly that. You're like looking at the last thing you did and attributing all the impact. And if it is tequila, it probably was the last thing, but for me. But you know, in a brand, there are so many touch points. I think it's so simplistic, and it doesn't take into account how complex the sales funnel is now. And everyone was, you know, consultants pushing out funnel diagrams, and even the funnel is outdated. It's just it's so fluid.